This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. One of the most well-known women of the 20th century died in May 1983. Chances are, if I asked you, the listener, to name that very famous woman, you wouldn't be able to do that. And yet this woman, during her long career, was considered one of the most prominent and influential officials in the United States government. She played a crucial role in implementing many important public policies, as well as being widely respected for her private career in public relations and labor relations. The name of the woman is Anna Rosenberg, and she served as close advisor to Presidents Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and Lyndon Johnson. Why then have her name and accomplishments been virtually forgotten? To find out, we hear from Christopher Gorham, an attorney, a lecturer of modern American history, and author of The Confidante, the Untold Story of the Woman Who Helped Win World War II and Shape Modern America. And Christopher speaks with us today from Boston. Welcome to Outrageous History, Christopher.
Thank you, Ernest, for having me, and thank you to your listeners at Outrageous History for tuning in today. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Now, you know, your biography of Anna Rosenberg clearly establishes her achievements, and we'll go through those in this interview. She was highly acclaimed by the press for those accomplishments, but following her death, she seems to have disappeared from public discussion. So how did you come to find out about Anna Rosenberg, and what led you to make this major commitment to write a biography to tell her story?
Ernest, one of my students, this is maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, wanted to write a paper on the Forgotten War, the Korean War. And I always like to, this is a high school in suburban Boston where I teach. And I always like to give my students 1 or 2 books to get them started. So I went to the library and I found a book on the Korean War, and I just happened to flip it open, and there was a photograph of President Harry Truman with a big smile on his face, and this striking looking woman next to him with a big smile on her face, and she literally had, civilian clothing. She literally had like a mink stole around her neck, and it looked like they were sharing a laugh or a joke. And what stopped me in my tracks was the caption, which said Anna Rosenberg, Assistant Secretary of Defense, and the year was 1951. So I thought to myself, wow, here's a civilian woman on good terms with the president. She has a top position at the Pentagon. It's during the early Cold War, and her last name is Rosenberg, which some of your listeners will know as the surname of the atomic spies here in the United States at that same time. So I was convinced there had to be a book about her, so I said to my student, let's go find some books about this Anna Rosenberg. We've never heard of her. We've heard of Eleanor Roosevelt, we've heard of Francis Perkins, but not Anna Rosenberg. And lo and behold, there were no books. And fortunately for me, and for the future book that was to come, her papers were left at Harvard, which is just a short bus ride away from where I'm talking to you today. So that was the genesis of the story.
Well, her upbringing, specifically as a Hungarian immigrant from Budapest, seemed to have a vital impact in her dedication to service to her adopted country, and especially through the influence of her father. Maybe tell us about her early history.
Yes, you're absolutely right. She comes to the United States in the years right before the First World War, and from Hungary, from Budapest, Hungarian Jewish family. And her father had been in the United States for 2 years prior to the rest of the family getting his business back in order. And he became she said, a fiercely patriotic American during those 2 years. And when she arrived as an adolescent girl, he instills in her these values of the United States at that time, values of accepting immigrants, of the idea that a citizen could rise as high in American society as their talents would allow, and the caprice of an emperor, the caprice of the old world would not have an effect on where one wound up in life. And she really took those lessons as a young person, and they became part of her. She was consistently throughout her long life Very, very proud to be an American and to call America her adopted home. And the values that she learned as a young person were values that she consistently held throughout her long life.
Yeah, and it didn't seem to take long for her to become involved in patriotic activism. As you point out, she was only, 15 or 16 years old when she organized the Coming Voters League.
That's
and she
right.
marched with the suffragettes and volunteered in war efforts for the First World War.
She was engaged in the big issues of the day, like you mentioned, in part because her father had suggested that would be that's what you do here in the United States, and she was a young suffrage marcher. There's one account where the American flag is that she's carrying at the head of the column is 3 times her size. She volunteered to be a Red Cross nurse when the United States joined World War I in 1917. And so politics are there for her at the very beginning. In fact, she wound up this is just such a fascinating story of her young life. She winds up being in the New York Times in 1917 for mediating a high school strike at the boys' high school, which was next door to her girls' high school. And that tells you not only that she was quite a personality, even as a young person, but that she was a mediator. She was a problem solver at a very young age, and that would hold her in good stead throughout her career as she later advised president after president.
Mm. And also in the very early stages of her young life, there was an interesting dynamic occurring with politics, with the various civil rights movements going on in the early 1900s, but also with the different characters she got involved with, those mentors who came into her life. How did that shape her career and life?
I think she had, Ernest, basically a political father and a political mother, obviously different than her parents. And the political mother was Belle Moskowitz. Anna Rosenberg meets Belle Moskowitz when she's, in her early 20s. Belle Moskowitz, the older woman, teaches her how to wield power. Belle Moskowitz was essentially the chief of staff of the governor of New York, a very powerful state, very wealthy state. And behind the governor is Belle Moskowitz, who's drafting legislation, and she's acting as the gatekeeper, and she's shaping policy for the Empire State. And what she showed young Anna Rosenberg was how a woman can move the needle of politics from behind the curtain, from behind the throne. And the other important formative figure that she meets at this same time was a Tammany Hall operator named Jim Hagan, who, they meet under funny circumstances. He's against women's right to vote, and she sasses him. But instead of being angry with her, he mentors her for the next 3 years on the retail politics of New York City. And so she does not have an education beyond high school, but she has an unofficial education in politics in New York and how to get things done and how to get problems solved. And again, it's a lesson that she's going to keep with her for her long career in government, in business, and in the military.
And when you mention about the oppression of women in the early 1900s, it was amazing that she ran a successful political campaign, and that was kind of an indication of what she would take hold of in her later career.
She said early on in her mid-20s, when she's getting her career off the ground, her career in public relations, labor relations, like you mentioned earlier, she mentioned also that she always made time for politics. So she's married now. She has a young son at home. She's a young businesswoman, but she, quote, always makes time for politics. And that leads to her, as you mentioned quite correctly, becoming one of the first American women to manage political campaigns, not just fundraise, but to actually do the legwork behind it and manage it. And I'm talking about United States Congress, U.S. congressional campaigns. So her facility with politics and political men was something that was apparent in her very early on.
And really, it seemed like it wasn't didn't take much longer to become involved with this huge other figure, that would be occur in her life. How did that happen? It happened about the same time, didn't it?
Not very long afterwards. You know, Belle Moskowitz is important, Jim Hagen's important, but no one was more important to young Anna Rosenberg than meeting Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt in 1928. Anna meets Eleanor Roosevelt first at a Democratic tea in New York City, and Eleanor Roosevelt says, "Well, what do you do for a living, young lady?" And she says, "Well, I have a PR and labor relations office over in Brooklyn, but I always make time for politics." And Eleanor says, "Well, I'd like you to meet my husband. He's running for governor of New York." And days later, Anna Rosenberg finds herself on the steps of the Roosevelt's twin townhouse in New York City. And days after that, she's on the gubernatorial team with characters like Francis Perkins and Jim Farley and Louis Howe. And as I tell my students and as I say to audiences, you know, this might be the most important, the 1928 New York governor's election might be the most important election in modern American history because of what happens 9 months later. Of course, the curtain of the Great Depression and Roosevelt's energetic response to the Depression. So just changed the trajectory of her life. You know, she might have been someone who maybe was involved in local politics as she continued her business, growing her business in New York City. But when she met the Roosevelts and she was on that gubernatorial team, that opened up a whole new number of possibilities for Anna Rosenberg and really changed the direction of her life.
You know, at this stage, I mean, there's a lot more, way more to talk about with the Roosevelts, of course. But at this stage, there were already two things that stood out in my mind here in reading this book. First, well, as you pointed out already, she had already had a high media profile. But secondly, her lack of a high school diploma and even her spelling and grammar seemed to be kind of a sensitive area for her, and continued to be that in her later years, even despite her career success.
She was self-conscious about her handwriting. She was, when she was very, very young, when she first arrived in the United States, she had been teased about her Hungarian dress. So she becomes a very, very stylish dresser. She becomes known for these elaborate hats that become her sort of her style, talisman. And she always felt, she said the word she used was, she felt she was enthralled to people who had gone on and gotten graduate degrees and professional degrees. And she felt enthralled to people with that kind of an education. But that said, that did not stop her from solving problems, both in terms of bringing unions together with labor, with management rather, but then later solving problems related to when politicians would ask her to go tackle a authority issue, she would have the ability to do that. So her self-consciousness about her education did not prevent her from having a certain confidence in her own ability to get things done and get things done well and with extreme prejudice for whomever was asking her to do those things.
Well, now let's go through that timeline of her time with FDR as he was running first for governor and then into those presidential stages. Take us through that timeline.
Well, she's on the team that helps him really upset victory in the governor's race in 1928, and that is going to pay dividends for her because Roosevelt's energetic response to the economic catastrophe is going to be scaled up when he goes to Washington as president of the United States in 1933. And he's going to call this program the New Deal. It's modeled after what he was doing in New York State. But the New Deal obviously needs hundreds of New Deal officers in the New Deal Army to make it work. And Roosevelt from New York State, from the Empire State, taps Anna Rosenberg, who's at this point, it's 1935-ish, she's 35 years old, taps this still young woman to be the only woman regional director of not one but two massive New Deal programs, the second of which is Social Security, which, as I say to audiences, imagine a world in which there's no Social Security. And then that's not a world we even would like to imagine. So this is a transformative piece of legislation that Anna Rosenberg was put in charge of rolling out in New York the most populous state, the wealthiest state in the country, by the president, and that was his home state. And why I think that's remarkable, Ernest, is I think what he's saying is, I need this to work. I can't sell this to Idaho or to Ohio or to Wyoming if I can't get these programs to work in New York State. And to entrust a 35-year-old woman that he knew way back in his gubernatorial race with that massive task really speaks well to her. And of course, she did it. She signed up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. She had elderly women would say to her, well, I can't tell you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age. And she would say to them, Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets. She was very, very proud to have that position and to help, her words, to see democracy in dynamic action, which is just an amazing phrase that she used, and I think one that's very accurate.
In the chapter, This Man Roosevelt, you made an interesting statement where you said, in her way, Anna played a role in FDR's evolution to be a more practical politician. What did you mean by that?
Well, thank you, Ernest, for being such a close reader. What I mean by that was she had taken Anna Rosenberg, again, without the, she hadn't gone to Penn, she hadn't gone to Columbia like Frances Perkins, she didn't have that type of education, but she had street smarts. She had practicality. Some of that practicality was just innate, but some of that practicality came from being closely aligned with Tammany Hall, the Tammany Hall people that she met with Jim Hagan. So when she is able to make suggestions to Roosevelt early on in the late 20s and early 30s, she has a certain practicality that helps, that he sort of adopts. And he becomes, maybe not at the very beginning, but he became a very, very adaptable politician, one who could keep different constituencies very, very happy with him at the same time, even though some of his policies might not fit together. So he becomes a master of that. And it's certainly not all because of Anna Rosenberg, but she did help him become a more fluid, more adaptable politician. And I think it was just because of the practicality of Tammany Hall.
And, at this stage, there were a couple of other people entering into her life that would be very prominent later on. We see this tension emerging between another FDR appointee, Frances Perkins, and then also with New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia.
Yes.
Tell us about those relationships.
The relationship with Secretary Perkins is it's kind of almost frustrating to me because they're very different women. Frances Perkins, as I mentioned, Penn, Columbia. She's a Boston Brahmin. She says tomato and theater. And Anna Rosenberg, with her lack of education, relatively speaking, has an accent that's part Bronx and part Hungarian, and is younger and is much more adept at dealing with the press. Anna Rosenberg becomes much more adept at dealing with men on Capitol Hill or politicians in general on a one-to-one basis. Again, she's the problem solver, a mediator. And Secretary Perkins, finds the fishbowl of Washington a very difficult place to live and is not comfortable going up on Capitol Hill and lobbying for her President Roosevelt. So, and the reason I say frustrating is because it's a very Rooseveltian thing to put two people on the same task in parallel. And, he did that with Anna Rosenberg, who basically becomes his labor specialist by the time World War II rolls around. And of course, he has Secretary Perkins, who's his labor secretary for his entire presidency, 12 years. The press at times called Anna Rosenberg Frances Perkins #2. They called her the de facto Secretary of Labor. And it's really unfair to both women. But it was Roosevelt's doing to put them on parallel tasks. And fortunately for Anna Rosenberg, she was able to solve a lot of problems that the Labor Department might not have been able to solve in many ways, just because of personality differences between the two women.
So now you're in the Great Depression. Anna Rosenberg plays really crucial roles in a couple of major policies, like the National Recovery Act and the Social Security, as you mentioned. Then comes World War II. What did that mean for Anna Rosenberg and for Roosevelt?
Well, I think this is a critical moment here for Anna Rosenberg, and one that I found very, very fascinating while I was doing the research and thinking about how this played out. We're talking about 1940-41. And, yes, you're right. Anna Rosenberg was an officer in Roosevelt's New Deal Army. But when you look at the calendar that the president kept, she's made a few visits to the White House, but not overly many, not terribly many. But she gets closer to the inner circle as other of Roosevelt's close advisors drop out. Missy LeHand, chief among them. Missy LeHand is the president's secretary, companion in some ways. She becomes ill at this time, 1941, and she's sort of incapacitated. There were others, Tommy the Cork, a young guy that Roosevelt was very fond of. They have kind of an ugly disagreement over Thomas Corcoran's woman that he wants to marry, and so he's out. And so Anna Rosenberg finds herself pulled ever closer into the Roosevelt Round Table. And by a few months before Pearl Harbor, we're talking about the summer of 1941, she's there. She's there in the White House being told by Roosevelt to help put out some very troubling, very nettlesome problems that are happening, such as the fact that the defense industry was not hiring Black Americans, and the Black American leadership wanted to march on Washington, which put Roosevelt in a tremendous pickle because he knew he needed Southern congressional support if the United States was to go to war, but he also knew that they would grant no concessions to the Black leadership. So he pulls in Anna Rosenberg, ace mediator, and says, go fix this or help me fix this. And she goes about doing that.
5 years into the war, so Anna's been this integral part of the decision-making process for the FDR administration. But now her boss has another role for her to visit the front lines in Europe where the fighting is actually taking place. Describe that mission of Anna's and also what it would eventually lead to in the form of the GI Bill.
Absolutely. Before I get to that answer, Ernest, I want to just wrap up an idea that I brought up a minute ago about visits to the president. Anna Rosenberg, over her career, had 130 visits with one-on-one with President Franklin Roosevelt, 130 times. That's what we know about. There were other visits to Hyde Park. There were certainly other visits that are off book. That was a lot more than a lot of the cabinet members had. She had tremendous access to the president. These are short meetings, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The president was busy trying to fight a war on two fronts, but she had tremendous access. He felt comfortable with her and also felt that there was not going to be any leaking, that what was said in the office that he was meeting with her was going to be kept in confidence, which was important to him. He could tell stories. She was a tremendous listener. And then she also had enough wit that she could make the president laugh and relax a little bit while he was trying to prosecute this war. And in 1944, as you mentioned, he makes this remarkable decision. Roosevelt himself had been sent to World War I when he was a young staffer at the Navy Department by President Wilson. And Roosevelt, as a young man, had seen the devastation of World War I in the trenches. When it's time to send an emissary to World War II, to Nazi-occupied France in 1944, remarkably, he picks Anna Rosenberg as that person. She is going to be the link between the commander-in-chief and the men that are serving their country and trying to win the war. And her mission was to see from the soldiers themselves, because that summer of 1944 was when they were politicians in Washington were discussing the need for a GI Bill. But she was to find out from the soldiers themselves what they wanted. And she spent 6 weeks in Nazi-occupied France. She was embedded with Patton's army. She talked to these GIs, on the hood of a Jeep while they were having a meal. They pulled pictures of their sweethearts out of their helmets to show her, and she wrote down what they were talking about and what they were saying, and in notebook after notebook. And when she got back to debrief Roosevelt, she opened up those notebooks and she said, "Mr. President, what they want is a college education. They want a piece of the America, a lasting piece of the America that they're trying to help save." And she said his face lit up. This was it. Because all they knew about the GI Bill is they didn't want to make the same mistake as World War I, where they gave those guys, $40 in a train ride home. They wanted to do something for the soldiers. They weren't quite sure what. Well, what they wanted was a college education. And of course, this generation, they'd only known wealthy men going to college. So this, for 12 million Americans in uniform, this was an opportunity to change their lives and to maybe enter the middle class.
And it changed the progress of the United States as well, having that huge number of the population becoming college educated.
Absolutely. It was far from perfect, but the Servicemen's Readjustment Act with the low-cost home loans and educational loans, there's an article in the New York Times from 1945, 46, and it says, half the people at NYU, at New York University, are veterans, and they're going to be dentists, and they're going to be business people, and they're going to open up a sporting goods store, and they're going to go on to graduate school or professional school. Paul Fussell said, the historian, he said the GI Bill, sent me to Harvard to study English literature. So it's transformative. The American middle class, to have 12 million Americans be elevated into the middle class, and to go out and be able to purchase homes for the first time. Transformative. And I think the subtitle of my book, Who Helped Shape Modern America, I think in large part her efforts with the GI Bill are why that subtitle is accurate.
Mm-hmm. Now, Roosevelt's health was never great. It deteriorated quickly during his third term near the end of the war. But his death wasn't really a surprise. It seems like. It was traumatic, even worldwide. But it seems like Anna didn't have much time to dwell on that, as close as she was to him, because prior to his death, he had already assigned her to a second mission in Europe. And when Harry Truman took over as president, he directed her to continue with that mission. What was that all about?
The last lunch that Roosevelt ever had at the White House, he was scheduled to go to Hyde Park, and then from there to go to Georgia, Warm Springs, Georgia. This is late March of 1945. The last lunch he ever ate at the White House was a one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg, where he told her that he was sending her on a second mission to wartime Europe to continue her work with the demobilizing troops. And a few weeks later, she was at the White House preparing for this journey, this mission, when she found out, as did the rest of America, that Franklin Roosevelt had suddenly died. And it was difficult for her. I know from a story that she told many, many years later that I heard about after the book was published. So it's not in the book, but I know that she found it very difficult, as did millions of Americans, to even conceive of a different president. He was the only president they knew. And for her to look at Senator Truman across the table and to see him as the commander-in-chief and the new president after he'd only been vice president for 80 or 90 days was a very, very difficult realization for her to make. But she did. And to Truman's credit, he said, well, if the boss wanted you to go on this mission, I want you to go on this mission. So off you go. By the time she gets to Europe, though, Ernest, her mission had to change, because instead of working with demobilizing troops, the first concentration camps had been liberated. And General Eisenhower cabled Washington and said, you need to send politicians, you need to send congresspeople and journalists immediately to bear witness to these atrocities. And so Anna Rosenberg was already in the country. She was flown to the Nordhausen concentration camp, and what she saw there, made a very profound impact on her life. So
she reported back to Truman when that trip ended. The war was over, but her service didn't end, and she did work together with Truman on some pretty important issues during that time. Can you let's say civil rights goals that they were trying to accomplish? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and just going back to that mission, that second mission in Europe, one of the things that the Americans found out to their horror was that displaced persons at the tail end of the war, at the very end of the war, after Nazi Germany had surrendered in May of 1945, the DP camps were filled with not only the victims of German aggression, victims of the Holocaust, but the perpetrators. So these displaced persons camps would have the Germans that were tormenting the Jews and the Jews in the same camp. So Truman was aghast. He said to Anna Rosenberg and to another advisor who was then in Europe, he said, you two, you got to change this. You got to fix this. So she helped sort that out along with this other advisor in Europe. And Truman keeps her close. And I think, having visited the Truman Library and talked to some of the people there, I think that it's because she knew Washington in a way that even Harry Truman did not. She had been in Washington for a long time. She had been sent up to Capitol Hill by President Roosevelt multiple times. And she knew her way around Washington, D.C. And I think for Truman, that was a person that you wanted to keep close because he could use a person like that. And so to his credit, he did. He kept her around and sought her advice. And when it was time to decide what to do with the terrible racism that broke out after the black soldiers were returning from the war, the terrible story of the American sergeant who was blinded down in the Deep South. This was a tremendous outrage for Truman personally, and he knew he had to do something. He also knew he did not have congressional support from the Southern lawmakers to do anything besides an executive order. So as he was deciding whether to draft an executive order to mandate a desegregation of the armed forces, he asked a panel of people, including Anna Rosenberg, to prepare arguments for that. And one of the arguments that she prepared, Ernest, was that integrated troops fought more effectively on the battlefield. And her proof was, because she always brought the receipts, her proof is that segregated units, they had brave soldiers. The black soldiers were brave under fire, but their leaders were always the worst commanders, the worst white commanders out there. So the integrated troops were more effective fighting units than the segregated troops. So that was part of the evidence that Truman used in very bravely making his executive order to desegregate the armed forces. So civil rights, Ernest, was another very, very consistent thing close to her heart for the duration of her career and duration of her life in the United States.
Now, she did go back to private life shortly after that because I think her business was suffering quite a bit, Do you think she was surprised when George Marshall asked her to return to government service, that as Assistant Defense Secretary? Because that had serious repercussions for both Anna and Marshall, troubling times.
It did. She had gone back to New York in the aftermath of World War II to help raise money and funds for victims of the Holocaust, and also to work with veterans, the American veterans who were returning to Greater New York. Those were two things that were very close to her heart. Meanwhile, Ernest, as you pointed out, she's getting her business back running, her labor relations and PR business back running, and finally buying the apartment in New York that she'd rented for decades. So, and her son, who also served in World War II, comes back. He gets married. Life is pretty good for Anna Rosenberg for 4 or 5 years until October of 1950, when she opens up a letter from the Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, whom she'd known in World War II, and it says, "Dear Anna, I hope that you can consider coming down to Washington and being my second in command at the Pentagon, starting kind of right away." And yes, I think it was a surprise to her. And she knew she couldn't say no to the general. I mean, everybody venerated General Marshall. He was the architect of victory in the Second World War for the United States. But she also had to say to him very candidly, "General, I wear the bullseye. I'm Jewish. I'm a civilian. I'm a New Dealer. I'm pro-union. they're going to come after me. The enemies are going to come after. I'm from Hungary, which is in Eastern Europe. During the early Cold War, they're going to come after me, and they're going to come after you. And fortunately, or to his credit, rather, General Marshall said, no, we're going to stick through this together. And so, he appoints her the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the desperate days of the Korean War and in the very, very early stages of the Cold War in Eastern Europe. Just a remarkable decision undertaken by Marshall and by Truman.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because there were several substantial and traumatic obstacles facing Anna's approval as Assistant Secretary, including those rather disgusting Senate confirmation hearings, or as you put it, the spectacle of disgrace. Tell us about that period.
Well, Marshall wanted her because he knew that she would go to bat for veterans on Capitol Hill. She could lobby effectively with those politicians. She'd proved that all through the Truman and Roosevelt years. And the armed forces had been decimated by budget cuts after World War II. But now you have occupation of Japan, occupation of Germany. You have trying to hem in the Soviets in Eastern Europe. And now you have a Korean War. The army had to be rebuilt, had to be over doubled in terms of personnel. And Marshall wants this woman to do it because she knows personnel. She's worked with the GIs before, and she's also worked with the politicians who can pass the laws that get the army back in fighting shape. This is all going to work, except for when Senator Joe McCarthy finds out about this. Now, he's not on the Senate Armed Services Committee, but he doesn't want a woman with the last name Rosenberg to become, in his words, the dictator of the Pentagon. So he conjures up a very vicious smear campaign over 2 weeks in late 1950, and it rivets Washington and it rivets the country because Anna Rosenberg is going to come face to face with a man that's going to accuse her of being disloyal, of being a traitor to her country, of being a secret communist. And she comes face to face with this man, and his story is shown to be lies. And very, very early on in his testimony, and the senators are gonna send him home, but Anna says, no, let's wait until after lunch because I want to come face to face with this man. And after lunch, at the Senate hearing, they come face to face, and he says, that's a woman who I saw at a communist meeting, and she says, you're a liar. And everybody believed her, and nobody believed this guy. So he was sent packing, and Anna Rosenberg became one of not only the first woman to serve in that high position in the Pentagon, but one of the first people, man or woman, to land a blow on Senator McCarthy during his reign of terror.
So she is approved to go on to take that position, and then she takes a third mission to the combat zone in Korea.
A third and a fourth. She had gone to Europe 2 times in World War II and made 2 trips to Korea during the Korean War. And Ernest, what I love is the consistency about her. The GIs, we're talking men and women now in Korea, male soldiers and women soldiers as well, or at least in the combat zone. And they loved her. They called her Aunt Anna, and they would write on a shell, "Dear Commies, compliments of Anna Rosenberg." And, she wanted to know from these men and women what they needed. Did they have everything from their government that would make their very difficult jobs bearable? And if the boots were not dry, if the socks were not well tended to, she was on the phone with the generals in Tokyo to make sure that these things were provided for the soldiers. She saw them, or rather, she respected our fighting people in a way that resonated with them. She was not there to be a VIP. She was not there to take a bunch of photos of herself. She was there to quite literally kneel in the mud with the guys and say to them, and I quote, "Pipe down, fellas, tell me the lowdown." And she would make sure that the colonel or the general was far enough away so that to be honest with her. She would open up the footlocker. She would open up the soup pot and make sure that the chow was good. So they really respected her, and more importantly, she respected them. And she did everything she could in her 26 months at the Pentagon to make sure that the soldiers and their families were taken care of during those dangerous couple of years in the Korean War.
So Truman declines to run again, but she has a relationship also with Dwight Eisenhower, even though he is a Republican. What was that relationship like?
In fact, Anna Rosenberg in New York, she was back in New York after World War II, and Eisenhower was back in New York as president of Columbia University for a short time. And Anna Rosenberg helped Dwight Eisenhower write his first political speech in 1946. And what frightened the dickens out of Anna Rosenberg and her, by this time she's separated from her first husband and seeing her, she's seeing Paul Hoffman rather, who is he's a Republican, even though Anna was a New Dealer throughout her life. She marries going to marry a Republican. But what scared the dickens out of Anna and her new person in her life, Paul Hoffman, was the idea that Senator Taft, a very hard right-wing senator from Ohio, might become the president, the next president, and he might become the president with a vice president in the figure of Douglas MacArthur. And, MacArthur was willing to, send nuclear bombers over China and Manchuria. So this was a terrifying prospect. So Anna Rosenberg is going to help Eisenhower pivot from soldier to statesman, in part because her belief, if there was going to be a war hero be president of the United States, it should be Eisenhower with his cool head and his centrist politics rather than Douglas MacArthur.
After Eisenhower comes Kennedy, but Anna Rosenberg had, I don't know what you call it, a tenuous relationship with Kennedy, even though none other than Eleanor Roosevelt advised Kennedy to make contact with Anna. But did the two of them ever work together?
So frustrating using that word again, Ernest, because, Kennedy has to go on bended knee to Eleanor Roosevelt and ask for her support. She was a Adlai Stevenson person, but he gets her support, and she says, the last two presidents have had women on the cabinet, and you ought to have a woman on the cabinet. And moreover, I have a name for you, Anna Rosenberg. She would be a wonderful cabinet member, but it was not to be. Kennedy not only did not ask Anna Rosenberg to serve on his cabinet, but had virtually no women of any decision-making power up and down his administration. And did they have? Did they connect? Only insofar as Kennedy saw her as a fundraiser, and as a loyal American, she did what she could, and she in fact co-hosted the 1962 birthday gala at Madison Square Garden, the one that we all know because Marilyn Monroe sang a very breathy "Happy Birthday" to the president. But Anna Rosenberg co-hosted that to raise money for Kennedy, Kennedy's reelection campaign. But very disappointing that President Kennedy did not use her up to her potential, because she probably would have said yes, and she certainly had a lot more to give her country and would have been proud to do so.
Now, with the assassination of President Kennedy, Anna played an important role once again in the life of the next president, Lyndon Johnson. But that relationship had been going on for decades, hadn't it?
A wonderful story. When Lyndon Johnson was a beanpole thin Texan who wanted to come up to Washington in that special election in the mid-1930s, Anna Rosenberg had already, they knew he was a New Dealer, in his heart. So Anna Rosenberg wired him $500 in 1935 or 36, a tremendous amount of money back in the 1930s. And it helped Lyndon Johnson win that special election and come to Washington. And he never forgot that. He was, love is maybe a strong word, but he and Anna Rosenberg saw eye to eye on all the great issues of the day, from the New Deal to victory in World War II to civil rights to what they could do about the Vietnam War, having black soldiers die in disproportionate numbers. They saw eye to eye on a number of issues. And 2 weeks after Kennedy was assassinated, Anna Rosenberg calls Lyndon Johnson at the White House and says, "I'd like to have a meeting with you. You're doing a good job," she says. "You're doing good. I'd like to have a meeting with you." So he sets up a meeting, and Ernest, that meeting was for her to say to him, you need to hire women up and down your administration, lots of them, and you need to give them power, and you need to give them license to do things for the country that they're serving. And he did. He hired 1,200 women up and down his administration, and really distinguished himself from the martyred Kennedy in a way that made him really helped cement him as a leader in his own right.
Now, we've gone through the various historic stages in Anna's life, but can you talk about the association with Eleanor Roosevelt? That seems to have been one of the most important relationships in her life.
Well, she was the first Roosevelt to meet, Anna Rosenberg was Eleanor in 1928. And Eleanor had tried to pull young Anna, who's in her late 20s and early 30s. Eleanor Roosevelt had tried to sort of pull Anna into her orbit of progressive women. And of course, Anna Rosenberg's background, Ernest, was so different. These were women that were married to bankers and married to people that owned railroads, and they'd gone to fine finishing schools. And Anna Rosenberg is there with her Bronx Hungarian accent, and very polished. Don't get me wrong, but it just wasn't her milieu. And she liked these women and respected them, but she was not going to be part of the sort of Eleanor's inner circle, at least not at that point. And she then becomes close to Roosevelt. But what's super interesting is that unlike almost anyone else, the people that were friends with both Roosevelts at the same time, you could count on one hand. It's like Harry Hopkins, and there's like two other New Dealers, and Anna Rosenberg, because you were on Team Eleanor or you were on Team Franklin, and you were not on both teams. They would not allow that. But Anna Rosenberg deftly walked that tightrope, avoiding the marital landmines, respecting both Roosevelts, and sometimes working as a conduit between the two of them. What I loved in the research, Ernest, is it was always Mrs. Rosenberg, Mrs. Roosevelt, from 1928 up to 1942. Very formal in their letters to each other. Then all of a sudden, Anna writes a letter to Eleanor in 1942, and it's about the Japanese internment, which is terrible, right? According to Anna, it was this terrible policy that led to a real violation of Japanese American civil rights. It was the wrong thing to do. And so Anna writes this letter to Mrs. Roosevelt, First Lady Roosevelt, and of course, Eleanor Roosevelt agreed with the sentiments of this letter. And thereafter, Ernest, from that day forward until she died in 1964, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote "Dear Anna" on her letters to Anna Rosenberg, and there were hundreds of them.
Very significant change there.
Yes, a very moving moment. To sort of put that in the chronology of the research was like, wow, this is where it all changed.
Now, Anna Rosenberg's dedication to the service of her country was widely acknowledged, not just in the U.S., but by other world governments. She was interviewed and quoted numerous times. She was had a high profile, a public profile. But in all honesty, until I read your book, and even as a longtime journalist from the 1970s onward, I had never heard of her. How did her service and her close connections with all these presidents disappear so thoroughly from the public eye after she died?
That's really the question, really. That is the central question of Anna Rosenberg. How did a woman who was in every leading magazine, she was in Vogue in 1942, Saturday Evening Post, she was in Photo, Essay, and Life magazine. She was in Time 46 times, Time magazine 46 times. She was in the pages of the New York Times from 1917 until 1983. She was in, as you pointed out, Der Spiegel. She was in Perry Match at various times in the early 1950s. She was a name that Americans knew, a household name. And how did she become so thoroughly lost? I love that phrase of yours. And I think there are multiple reasons. One is her self-consciousness about her own education or lack thereof. A second reason is she had spent one-on-one time with not only the great leaders of World War II, but some of the great leaders of American history, 250 years worth. George Marshall, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight General, and then President Eisenhower. And when she was asked to turn those conversations into a memoir or to trumpet her own story, she found that idea very distasteful. She was not going to spill the tea after being in, Roosevelt's company 130 times, that was private. That was the president entrusted her to do those things, and she was not going to cash in on that with a memoir like a lot of the post-Roosevelt people did. Another reason is, of course, the unfortunate coincidence of her surname. When Eleanor Roosevelt tried to put her in touch with a biographer, Anna said, "No, I'm not interested." When Henry Luce tried to put her in touch with the biographer, she said, "I'm not interested." And I think in the 1950s, she doubled down on this because of her last name, Rosenberg, which just happened to be the same surname as the atomic spies. So that was a very difficult time for Americans named Rosenberg who are not related to the atomic spies. They were shunned, they lost jobs, they lost friends, they were kicked out of school, and so forth. I've had people come up to me in tears at my events who either were named Rosenberg or had relatives named Rosenberg at that time, who lived through that time, and traumatic. So it was another reason for her to not trumpet her own career, but to always deflect to the great leaders that she served: Roosevelt, Eisenhower, the soldiers, both men and women who were keeping the country safe. So there's a host of factors, Ernest, I think that conspired. And the other thing is, without having a institution like Penn, Columbia, Harvard to keep her flame alit, that was another thing that other people have that she didn't. So there was a whole host of reasons why Anna Rosenberg went from being in the pages and on the covers of American magazines and newspapers to being almost thoroughly forgotten. And I hope, as I talk to you today and around the country over the last 3 years, I hope that this changes. I hope that Anna Rosenberg becomes once again a name in the American historical discussion, commensurate with her contributions in the 20th century.
I have one final question for you. Moving ahead to our current times, because I think that's where relevancy plays a part.
Yes.
With the likes of Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Madeleine Allbright, Kamala Harris, Gretchen, Whitmer, Tulsi, et cetera, how do you think Anna would feel about the current role of women in the decision-making process in the United States and other nations?
Well, I'll start by saying she was rather bitterly disappointed in the night. By the time she died in 1983, she was disappointed in the state of women leaders at that moment in the early 1980s. This was the Reagan, counter-revolution, and she expected, she might have expected, for instance, Kennedy to have a woman on the cabinet, maybe even her, but she was disappointed that more women did not follow her into the highest echelons of government, the military, and business. She dreamed of that. She wanted that. She had a couple of women that she tried to bring along as well, one of whom became a very well-known judge in New York State. But by the time of her death, it hadn't happened. What would she think about today, or the time of Madeleine Allbright or Condi Rice, or the many governors, women governors throughout the United States today, and women leaders throughout the world today? I think, Ernest, there was a large gap in time where between the 80s and today, and I think we're on the other side of that gap, and I think she would recognize that. We're on the other side of that gap where women are in positions of leadership, not only leading states around the world, but leading more states here in the United States. And I think she might also recognize, I hope she would recognize, that the current situation for women in the United States government might not be the permanent situation. We might get through this and have a chance at a woman president or more women leaders, because I think there's a sense that there was certainly a sense for her. She believed that women were better able to solve problems that vexed nations. And she said very clearly why that was. She said men will butt heads. And she said, me, I'm a woman. I can listen to their positions and I can mediate between them. And then she said, Ernest, very importantly, she said, then I fade out into the background. So we don't ask women to fade into the background today. We want them to go ahead and solve problems that vex us around the world and around the United States. And we want them to stay right there in the forefront. More women, keep doing it. And I think Anna Rosenberg would be somebody that they could look back on as an inspiration.
Well, Christopher, this has been such a compelling look into a crucial period of American history and this intriguing woman. I really thank you for your insight today.
Ernest, thank you very much, and thanks to your listeners of Outrageous History for bearing with me today. And I hope you enjoy listening about the career of the great Anna Rosenberg.
And I thank all of you for tuning in. For online information about this and other podcast topics, log on to outrageoushistory.com. For Outrageous History, I'm Ernest Granson. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.